the human-built landscape is a horizontal landscape. It's not a horizontal landscape geographically, but the city itself is a kind of a as a horizontal space, even as it now is beginning to verticalize or is continuing to verticalize. And I think that there's something really interesting metaphorically about that kind of the breadth of that sprawl, right? Sprawl is something that we tend to that tends to be condemned in the context of the city. I am also someone who has at times condemned it. I think that, Los Angeles or Southern California as a region is a region of sprawl, but also a region of neighborhoods. And I think that there's a way that it forces us, in a certain sense, to keep two potentially opposing ideas in our head at the same time. And for me, the key element is the key benefit of that horizontality, I think, is a kind of seepage and a kind of sort of lateral movement, or the ability to move laterally, whether as an artist or as a human or both or either. And so I think, there's a lot of bleed through. There's a lot of cross cultural pollination. There's a lot of cross genre work. There's a lot of multidisciplinary work. One of the things that we've been trying to do in Airlight is publish a lot of work that crosses those genre and disciplinary lines. Um, but I also want to say that, when I was first here, I was really, because I was an outsider and I was trying to figure out the city and the region and the landscape. I wrote a lot and thought a lot about from the point of view of explaining Southern California. I mean, we would do panels at the LA Times Festival of Books. There were always people explaining Southern California. My perspective in the last 10 years or so has shifted fundamentally from speaking about Southern California or writing about Southern California, although I still do quite a lot of that, to writing and speaking from Southern California. And so I've become much more engaged and enmeshed with this notion of what is the Southern California sensibility, or what are the Southern California sensibilities. It's too complicated and various a culture to have only one. And to think about what it means to be a global writer or a global citizen, as well as a citizen of the whole country, but really a global writer, global reader, but from the point of view of living in Southern California. How does Southern California infiltrate us, whether as homegrown people here or people who came here, and how does it change the way we think and operate and engage with writing and with text? For me, for many years, I'm a walker. I wrote a book about that, and one of the key texts that I've been engaged in kind of deciphering or reading is the city or the actual streetscape of Los Angeles. And so what I thought I would do tonight is read a relatively new essay. It was published in August in a wonderful collection called Writing the Golden State, edited by Romeo Guzman and Caribbean Fregosa, that Angel City Press published, a kind of multi-author anthology of essays on California. And mine is a walking essay, but also I think a reading the city essay through that lens, and it's called Lost. So I'll start by reading that, and then we can kind of move into some further conversation. The streets I was walking were not unfamiliar. On the one hand, excuse me, let me start again. The streets I was walking were not familiar. On the other hand, were not unfamiliar. Hey, hang on a second. It'd be useful if I could read my own writing. So give me 1 second. I apologize. Okay. The streets I was walking were not unfamiliar. On the other hand, they were not familiar enough. I was in South Robertson, or as the city calls it, Rainier Village, although I had never heard that term before. My wife and I were staying in an Airbnb on ULIN Street, just north of Hamilton High School. We had once tried to buy a house around the corner on Hargis, across the street from Rainier Park. We'd been outbid. We were always outbid. This is one reason we remain renters now. The house had a koi pond in a small backyard. We dreamt of sitting beside it as our children played with the kids from Shenandoah Street Elementary School. My wife had never quite gotten over losing the house. It was the one that got away. Now we were back, who knew for how long, displaced by a flooded bathroom from our rental in Mid-City, where we'd moved in the aftermath of all that loss. Still, loss. Isn't that what we were again encountering? Isn't that what this was all about? We'd been hustled out of our duplex so fast we didn't have time to pack. I'd discovered the water on a Sunday morning. By that afternoon, our bathroom was stripped to the studs. Now the management company was insisting on testing for mold and lead before rebuilding. There was other work they wanted to do. A month, the landlord conjectured, even as he acknowledged that he didn't really know. We'd spent 3 nights in a hotel before moving over here. The place was adequate, 4 small rooms and an eat-in kitchen. What it wasn't was ours. I knew the neighborhood best from having driven through it. I knew it best from taking the kids to camp. Pico west to Robertson, where I turned south, passing the Robertson Branch Library with its wall of quotes from, among others, Jorge Luis Borges and Oscar Levant. I've given up reading, the latter postured. It takes my mind off myself. It seemed a strange sentiment for a library, although it also made me laugh. Our children had gone to camp in Culver City. We'd pass under the 10, where one summer we saw a pigeon nesting in the traffic light at National, then follow Culver Boulevard to Overland. If traffic was uncooperative, we'd take the side streets, which is how I came to know this corner of the grid. Los Angeles is strange like that, small communities tucked within the larger sprawl. This one was bounded by Robertson, the freeway, and to the north, Cadillac Avenue, a triangular pie slice 10 blocks long. You wouldn't know it to look at it. I'd only discovered it by consulting a map. This was part of the problem or the challenge that Robertson, a north-south street, angled slightly here, conforming to the 10 and Venice Boulevard, both of which bisected the neighborhood along a southwest tilt. Our first full day on Olin, I woke early. I set out for a walk. This is what I do most mornings, looping meanders on a series of predetermined arcs. I've been a walker in the city since my childhood in Manhattan, when walking was a source of freedom, or at least autonomy. I brought the habit when I came to Southern California, a vernacular of the streets. Los Angeles confounded me when I arrived here more than 30 years ago. A key aspect of my acclimatization was to walk. On the most basic level, it was a strategy to find myself by making the city small. It didn't occur to me that this was what I was doing that first morning on Olin. It didn't occur to me that I had been exiled. That would come later, during the 4.5 months we spent traversing the city, from this Airbnb to another in Pico Robertson and then a third in Hollywood. It wasn't like being lost, exactly. We always knew in some sense where we were. All the same, how else to describe it? The dislocation felt as if it would never end. Each neighborhood was one I thought I recognized, although, of course, the opposite also turned out to be the case. From the Airbnb, I followed Olin east until I reached the park. In the distance, I could hear the hiss of the 10. When we looked at the house on Hargis, the agent had tried to frame this as a selling point. It was like listening to waves break along the shoreline, he'd suggested, before telling us to consider a variable rate mortgage. After we demurred, he said maybe we weren't committed enough. I knew it then that we wouldn't get the place. I knew it then that we would lose. 16 years later, I noted just how small it was. Unlike my wife, I did not regret being outbid. No, all I wanted was to keep walking. South on Rainier to Cattaraugus, north on Shenandoah, past the elementary school. It was early in September, so the term was already in session, although the hour was too early for teachers and students yet to have arrived. I continued to Cadillac, crossed Robertson at the light, and entered Beverlywood, where the street names changed and the macadam looped or cul-de-sac or had no outlet, as if this were a gated community without the gates. It was strange. For all the luxury on these blocks, the large houses with their sweeping vistas, the abutting stretch of Robertson was a desert where the pandemic had turned it into one. The sidewalks were pocked with pitted storefronts. There was a Domino's and a Taco Bell, a coffee place, and a bakery. It didn't make sense, or maybe it was another contradiction. Southern California is full of them. All those years driving through this part of town, and I had never really seen it. This was the Los Angeles conundrum writ large. A city experienced at 35 miles an hour will never reveal its nuances, no matter how much we imagine we might get to know them. In that sense, we are always lost when driving, always at a distance, always disconnected, disassociated, displaced in every application of the word. This was why I walked, or one reason, to place myself within the landscape, to feel my presence in the street. I noticed details, the pet groomer on the corner, radio news murmuring in a low susurration from the back door, the way that north of the park Shenandoah narrowed until it became more of an alley with no sidewalk. I didn't see a lot of pedestrians, and when I did, I kept my distance. The pandemic had left me wary of coming close. But this was part of walking also, that it allowed me to be alone even as I moved through the city, that even as I navigated traffic and the occasional presence of other people, I could get lost inside my head. I wanted to immerse in my thinking. I craved the space of it, the detachment it required. I remembered the first moment I understood that no one knew what I was thinking, that my mind belonged to me alone. I was in first grade, and the realization struck me like a bullet or a method of release. This was what I did when I walked, to wonder furiously, to scheme and plan and settle. It had become a meditative practice in its way. in the world, but not of it, as the Christians or some of them profess. Although I am not a Christian, I will admit to taking some comfort there. The difference was that this was not my neighborhood. The difference was that this was not my home. In mid-city, I would often proceed as if on autopilot, as if walking were a matter of muscle memory. An hour and a half would pass, and I would barely notice. I was just putting one foot in front of the other as I moved along accustomed streets. Here, I did not have that level of belonging. We had not been in the Airbnb for a day. As I crossed back out of Beverlywood, I was moving roughly east, or so I imagined. I was thinking about the work I had to do and when we might go home. I was trying to catalog everything that seemed to be at stake. I wouldn't have said I was lost, although I wasn't paying attention, at least not the right sort of attention or to the necessary stuff. Then I turned a corner and found myself on a small street that dead-ended against the freeway. I couldn't say exactly where I was. I stood for a moment listening to the traffic. It did not sound at all like surf. After a moment, I crossed back. Was it north or south? To the lip of the street. I took a left on Garth and another on Corning and came face to face with the freeway again. This was not correct, but what to do with it about it? I was at a loss. I took out my phone, opened the Maps app. It was there I found myself. I watched as I turned in what I imagined must be the right direction, but the blue dot that was me kept slipping away. I doubled back once more to where Garth bled into Beverlywood. I knew where I was now, but had no idea of how I'd come around. Passing Holt and Halm and Bedford, I could see parents and children walking in small clusters towards the elementary school. I had not expected they would lead me back the way I'd come. When I first moved to Los Angeles, I used to get lost all the time. I would forget to turn while driving and end up miles off my route. I would see a cluster of tall buildings and ask. The answer was almost never yes, if they were downtown. This too is part of why I walk here. Let's call it a gesture of constraint. It's a matter of intimacy, in other words, of living out my private life in the city's public space. And yet, cities do not belong to us. They have a life, a logic of their own. If they are places where we may find ourselves, they are also landscapes in which we can get lost. All it takes is one wrong turn, one moment of inattention, especially on streets that are not unfamiliar, although not familiar enough. I was embarrassed, I'll admit, that this should happen in a city where I had lived for more than 30 years. But this is all how it always is. Anytime we step outside the door. Thank you. That's the reading.
Wonderful. I love that walking essay too. It's for our creative writers who are joining us tonight is an essay about the act of walking and the things that you see along the way and capturing those observations and then those reflections. So beautiful essay. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I think, one of the things that essay, I mean, well, whatever. One of that thing that essay is a kind of a classic form for me because I'm always kind of I'm always writing to figure out what I think. So in a certain sense, writing an essay, whether this essay or other essays, is a kind of a walk in the same way. I'm kind of moving through a territory and sort of seeing what's there, trying to understand or experience it. But at the same time, I'm also really interested in writing about small things. I mean, I don't only write about small things, but I'm interested in kind of taking apart something that might appear initially too small or insignificant to write about, right? Taking a morning walk in your neighborhood. Where's the frisson? Where's the juice in that? But I really do think that, it is all about the telling or the way that it is told and not so much about the material. Sometimes, I'm sure everyone in this room knows at least one person in your life who can't tell a story to save their life. And they might have had the most interesting experiences that, like whatever, they might have, I have a friend who described once going camping and and a jaguar walked into the campground. So, obviously in a country or landscape where there were jaguars. But to be honest, the story was told so poorly. I don't remember any of it. It's the only detail of the story I remember. And so, yet at the same time, you got writers like, for instance, Nicholson Baker, who wrote an entire novel, a brilliant novel, The Mezzanine, about a guy buying shoelaces on his lunch break. So I really, when I was starting out as a writer, I was told, write what you know, write from your experience. And it was such a stymieing idea in a certain sense because I didn't feel like I knew anything. I was like, what am I going to write about? I'm a teenager. I have my own experiences, but nobody cares about that. And I think that, a couple of things there. What I realized was that the subject, as I say, doesn't have to be big. In fact, it may be most interesting to unpack something fairly small and fairly common, certainly in the sense of readers having shared some of those experiences and being able to kind of relate to what you're talking about. But I also think that it becomes a matter of that exploration. It becomes a matter of the way the mind moves through the material, the way that we find whatever the through line is. And so, walking obviously both as a metaphor but also as an activity becomes a really interesting way of approaching that.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview with you, and I mean, you've written a whole book about walking, sidewalking, right? Which is an interesting thing to do in a city that is famed for its non-walking culture and its car culture. And so, I thought that was really interesting. And I don't know if you want to talk about how that idea came about,
Yeah,
the
I'd be
extent
happy
of
to.
it.
I mean, I that idea sat like most of my books develop over a long period of time, and then get written in kind of bursts. But so in the case of sidewalking, I had, as I said, I've been a walker since I got here. When my wife and I first moved here, we shared a car. And she had a day job, and I did not. So I was home writing, and I was working part-time for a small alt weekly, long since gone, the late lamented Los Angeles Reader, which was about a mile and a half from their office was about a mile and a half from where we lived. So it didn't occur to me to do anything else. I was like, I live a mile and a half from the office. If I'm going to the office, I can just walk. You take the car. If I'm in the neighborhood, I'll just walk. If I need to go get lunch or go to the grocery store, it's right there. I can walk. So it didn't occur to me, but I began, obviously was aware that it's not a walking city. There weren't a lot of people walking on the streets. I was the oddball walking around. And yet it allowed me to slow the city down. I mean, I use the phrase in that essay, and I use it a fair amount in talks like this. The idea was to make the city small. Los Angeles daunted me when I first got here. I didn't understand it. It was too big. It felt like it was too amorphous. Back to this idea of sprawl, but also I didn't know it well enough or at all, so I couldn't actually differentiate between the neighborhoods. It all just looked the same. There's that great Joan Didion line from Pacific Distances, which is that, you drive through the city, narrative sort of falls apart as you drive through sort of neighborhoods that all look the same to each other, that aren't clearly differentiated. I'm paraphrasing her terribly. I apologize, but that was true of me too. And so I found that walking, I began to notice these subtle demarcations. Like I began to notice that, if I lived in the Fairfax district, if I walked, half a mile south to Wilshire, I was in Mid Wilshire, or Miracle Mile. They were different, they were related, they were adjacent, but they weren't the same. Or I would end up in Carthay, or I would end up in Pico Robertson, or whatever it was, right? And so all of these small communities that kind of abutted each other had their own personality. But if I was driving the city, certainly if I was driving freeways where I was kind of not even driving the city, but I was driving sort of over the city in a certain way. But even if I was driving in the city, I was mostly driving major boulevards. And so I wasn't really getting into the community. I wasn't really seeing them. Whereas when I was walking, I was avoiding major boulevards as much as possible. But mostly because I didn't want to get killed. And so I began to see the city in a different kind of a way, and it started me thinking. Even back then, I wrote a little bit about walking. The first real thing I wrote was maybe 2005. I wrote an essay about walking in the neighborhood for the Los Angeles Times, where I wasn't working there yet, but I was writing for them. And I started thinking like maybe there's something I could do here. I wrote another couple of essays about I lived in Pico Robertson, which was an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. So I wrote a couple of essays about that. I'm a secular Jew, and apostate in many ways, but I was really struck by the fact that entire community on Friday night and Saturday became a walking community. I would see families, dozens of people walking to shul and walking back from shul, and I really felt that was intriguing to me. I didn't know that about Pico Robertson when I moved there. It was just where we found a house that we could afford, but it was really. It felt like walking in a central way, right? Walking as a part of life, not walking as a contrivance, but walking as an element of a lifestyle. And so I wrote an essay about that. And then I got really interested in the Grove, which had opened in that period. I lived, again, walking distance from the Grove, which I still do. And again, one of the things that fascinates me about Los Angeles is that every cliche about the city is true and equally untrue, right? So yes, and it's true of the elements of the city too. So yes, on the one hand, the Grove is just a capitalist horror show, right? A fake city street that the entire purpose of is to keep you on the street so you'll buy more stuff. Right. That's why they have the dancing water for your kids. That's why they have the music piped through. That's why they have the Christmas stuff when they have it. That's why they have the musicians on the green. That's why they have all the food stalls. The idea is it's not a street, which originally was, streets were conduits. They were not a place where you would hang out. It is a place that is designed to keep you there. So you'll be like, oh, I need to get something for my iPhone. Oh, I need to go to Sephora. Oh, I need to go to Nordstrom's and buy shoes. So, I agree with that. But on the other hand, and again, this was partly had to do with my experience. When the Grove opened, I had young kids, and it was a place where I could drop them off for a couple of hours and allow them to begin to have an autonomous experience. And actually an autonomous, if ersatz, urban experience where they might walk around, they might have a serendipitous encounter, they might run into somebody they knew, they might feel a sense of autonomy over themselves and a way that they could kind of control their own environment and their own movement through that environment. And so again, half it's six of one, half dozen of the other, right? I mean, yes, the Grove is all of the things all of the bad things we ascribe to it, but it is also this really interesting laboratory. And I wanted to think more deeply and perhaps push back against my own preconceptions about culture and how it works. For me, certainly in the nonfiction work, a lot of what I'm doing is trying to deconstruct something that I thought I knew, but it isn't really working for me anymore. And I want to provoke myself, right? I want to provoke myself first because I also want to provoke you. Or whoever's reading the work, and not get in your face, although if that's necessary, yeah, but also just to think more broadly, think more openly, think more elusively, think more in a more slippery way. And that too, that's the porousness in the sense that I was talking about at the beginning. And that is something that I think is really fundamental to Los Angeles. So the idea of writing a book about Los Angeles through the lens of walking was like that, right? It felt, on the one hand, it felt, and it is totally counterintuitive. On the other hand, that shift in focus, that using a different lens, for me at least, allowed me to look at the city in a way that I wasn't programmed to necessarily and see things that I don't know that I would have seen otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. That idea of I mean, we are programmed. And then, I was just talking with the students the other day about how many of the students, walk around with the earbuds and the phone and kind of shutting off, that experience around them, and then, challenging themselves to go out and have, an unaccompanied walk with just themselves to see what they see. And, their responses were really interesting, which I loved. So just to let everybody know, you can put questions in the chat if you want to. And David, you were going to talk to us a little bit too about this idea of, I mean, you're so knowledgeable about California literature. California sensibility is this kind of term that you had coined, and writing about that. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that for us.
Sure. I mean, I mean, just in terms of what I've been thinking about, I mean, I've not for the first time now, but as I'm writing this other piece, I think, I mean, we can well, we can talk about the literature and then move from there. But I think that, right, California, well, we'll start with the literary culture. California as a literary culture, I think of, I don't think it is anymore, but I think for a long time it was an outlier. It was kind of an outlier sensibility. And I think to its benefit. Right now, I think, and I will just say this parenthetically, um, I think it is the absolute epicenter of American literature. I think, I mean, look at Percival Everett, look at James and what's happened with James, but look at Percival's 40 plus year career with 34 novels that, he's been building this thing, from the early 1980s. Look at a writer like Viet Thanh Nguyen, look at Maggie Nelson, look at Caribbean Fregosa, and I mean, all of these writers, I think, are major American writers, and they're all operating out here. Partly because many of them were born and raised here, but there is also partly, Percival, like me, like Viet, come from, like Maggie, come from other places. And so I think that it's the breadth that Los Angeles, or that California in general, but Southern California also allows. The first book I wrote, I edited a couple of anthologies of Southern California literature about a decade after I got here, which was part of my learning process. The first book I wrote was a nonfiction book about, I guess we would call it about the sociology of earthquakes or the sociology of seismicity, which came out in 2004. Before I moved here, I was not a nonfiction writer at all. I was a fiction writer and a poet. I was not a scientist. I failed the last science class I ever took, which was high school chem. I failed. I had no interest in science. In college, because I went to college in a more progressive era, they had no core curriculum, so I filled my science requirement by taking history of science because it was books I could read. So no, none of that at all. If I had not come to California, I would have never gotten interested in earthquakes. Partly because I would have never had to confront them, the myth of solid ground. Yeah, I would have never had to confront them. But also, I would have been too intimidated to, like, who am I to write a book about, like, about geology? Like, I know nothing about geology. But there was a kind of freedom here, a kind of breadth where I felt like I could explore this idea and see what happened. Nobody was paying that much attention. Nobody was keeping tabs. And if it fell apart after 6 months or something, fine. It was just what it was. So initially, and I did this with a number of early books, I wrote a long magazine, a piece for the LA Weekly, a cover story for the LA Weekly to see what my interest level was. And when I finished that, I knew there was more that I wanted to do. And, we used that piece as a proposal to turn into a book. But I basically was using my ignorance, let's say, as a tool. I went and hung out with seismologists at the Geological Survey at Caltech. I spent days hanging around with Lucy Jones, just asking her the stupidest questions I could, and I felt permission to do that. I was like, I was like, I know nothing. Let me ask you the stupidest question I can, and then we'll build from there. And I think that there was a kind of porousness. On the one hand, those scientists were not used to talking to a writer like me, a journalist like me. And so I think they were intrigued. But also, I was intrigued, and I ended up writing a book that felt like it certainly had memoir components. It certainly had, even though it wasn't fiction, it had novelistic and narrative components. It had a ton of reporting and science in it. It didn't fit any mold that I was aware of. And that too, I think, was part of the freedom, right? The freedom of working in Southern California, the freedom of exploring my own fascination or my own obsession, the freedom of not expecting anyone to really pay attention to any of the work, which can be a crushing thing, but for me was a liberating thing. I could just pursue the work I wanted to pursue on its own terms and let whatever its movement into the world be what it was, what it would be. I had no control over that. And I do know, I mean, I just, as a native New Yorker, as someone who grew up and tried to participate in the literary culture there before I came out here, I know myself well enough to know that I would have never allowed myself that freedom in New York. I would have spent too much time looking over my shoulder at what everybody else was doing. I would have gone to parties where people were talking about, their book deals or their book advances or whatever. And, here that might have happened if I was a screenwriter or involved in Hollywood, but I wasn't. So, one of my favorite stories before I got here, I had a friend who was a writer here who finished a novel. This is in the late 1980s and went to a cocktail party and he was in a really good mood. And someone said to him, "You seem very happy." And he said, "Yeah, I finished writing a novel today." And this person turned to him and said, "Why?" So yeah, I love that story both because it's years ago, so the pain has worn off for that person, but also because it tells, for me, that idea of working a little bit under the radar. Again, why write a book about Los Angeles through the lens of walking? Why work on, there's a certain freedom and anonymity in the writing process. And as I say, I think over the years that has changed. Now we have a critical mass of brilliant American writers writing out of Southern California. Linnell George, another example. Naomi Hirahara, Walter Mosley, who doesn't live here anymore, but certainly writes a lot about the place. Hector Tobar. All of these writers are the major American writers of our time. And it's not to say that that we're the only place, but we are a central location now. And I think but on our own terms, and I think that evolution grew out of those earlier days when no one was really paying attention, so everybody could stake out the territory they felt was most necessary to them.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And we've had Percival Everett and a couple of others that you mentioned here at PCC, so we're really lucky, to be in this location and have these wonderful writers come. And that kind of shifts to one of our students, Fern, had a question. It can shift to if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your development as a writer. And I know that I was listening to another interview where you were saying that you always knew you wanted to be a writer and that you grew up surrounded by books as a kid. And you had that interesting experience with a career counselor who was telling you, you're never going to be a writer, whatever. But Fern, did you want to ask your question? Um,
Sure.
yeah, go for it.
So we were reading your essay on your experience writing your first books, and
My apologies for all of the bad behavior in that essay.
yeah. Well, so I was curious. So you've had a whole career since then, and like with the LA Times and everything. But so I was curious, do you still kind of start off by writing an epigraph? Is that still like a habit for you, and what does it add?
It is a habit for me. I don't always keep them, but I almost always use them. I mean, certainly with books, a book will have an epigraph, but in certain books, like in Sidewalking, each chapter has its own epigraph also. And recently, like in the last couple years, I mean, I published a short story last year that had an epigraph in the draft, and I cut the epigraph before the story was published. So sometimes I'll pull them out if they feel too on the nose. But for me, the most honest answer I can tell you is I don't know. It's something I like. But what I do know, and what I'm thinking about now, is that when I was young, when I was in high school and college, I used to keep a quote notebook, and so when I would see something. It could be, it wasn't only from literature. If I saw a movie and there was a great line of dialogue, I'd come home and write it down. If there was a song lyric I thought was really profound or moving or spoke to me in some way, I would write it down. If I was reading a book or a story or a magazine article or something in the newspaper or even a news story, I remember once reading, I mean, this is strange. I remember once reading an obituary of a British philosopher named Malcolm Muggeridge, who I've never read, 1977, in the New York Times obituary section, and I copied out a number of his quotes from there because I was moved by them, or they struck me in some way. So I think it may have to do with that, and that was, I definitely think that when I was that age, um, I was trying to place myself in some way. I was trying to place myself in terms of what I was reading. I was trying to place myself in terms of what I was trying to write. And so if I saw a quote that seemed, that I could relate to, that seemed like it was addressing something I was interested in, I felt like I had found, a fellow traveler in a certain sense. So I wanted to make a note of it. And I do think that we're always in conversation as writers. We're always in conversation with the books we read. We're always in conversation with the other with as with the walking, we're always in conversation with the material that we're taking in. And so I want to be very conscious about that as well. If you look at Sidewalking, for example, one of the movements of that book, besides the excuse me, besides the pedestrian movement, is that we is besides the pedestrian movement, is a movement through the literature of the city. I'm always talking about stuff I've read that relates to the community, or say a movie like Falling Down. One of the chapters is called Falling Down and involves partially a discussion of that film. To me, those things are part of the vernacular and voice of the city as well, and so it feels natural to me to be in conversation with all of that, including those other writers. And I think that the source or the genesis of the epigraph is probably has something to do with that.
Great question, Fern. Um, I really enjoyed your book on reading, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, especially now with, all of the book banning and everything that's been happening, and how reading is a revolutionary act.
Well, there's a reason I think that autocrats target artists in general and writers in particular, because what writing and literature is doing, both on the excuse me, both on the level of the writer and I think on the level of the reader, is to show us new possibilities and to question pre-existing hierarchies, right? I try to write, I don't know how I want to quite say this. I try to write from the center of my own experience, which is not to say that that there's not an ideology there, but I'm not writing to adhere to an ideology so much as I am to try and interrogate a set of experiences and see them on their own terms, even, or maybe especially, as I was saying earlier, if they provoke me or push back against my own internal ideologies, right? I'm writing to ask questions more than to ask answer, more than to answer, than to come up with answers, particularly in nonfiction, but also in fiction. I'm writing to ask questions. I'm not particularly interested in answers. I think that's difficult for people who don't think that way, or it can be threatening, and it can certainly be threatening to authority in a certain sense, not in like, a going to the barricades kind of way, although maybe that as well, but just it's dangerous for authority when people think for themselves, and thinking for themselves is what literature and art, it's not the only thing literature and art are about, but it's one of the key things that literature and art are about. So I'll just say that now. And in terms of the book banning and all that, that has always been going on. I don't want to say that it's at a peak now, because I don't think I don't see it getting better at any point in the near future. But I do, but I understand why why literature is something that autocrats are scared of, and I think that maybe they should be. But I also think that that conversation, it's the humanist tradition that we're talking about, and the humanist conversation about what it means to be a living creature, what it means to be a human being, what it means to have a soul. And I think that that's also the essential, that's what makes it so essential. For me, in the lost art of reading, it wasn't a matter of it wasn't a matter of book banning at that time, although I was aware of book banning, and all of that stuff was going on. It was really a matter of technological overload. I had when I took the job as book editor at the LA Times in 2005, I was still on dial-up. I didn't have Wi-Fi, or, and I preferred it that way because it was slow. It was slow to get online. I was slow to be able to maneuver online. I didn't spend a ton of time on the computer. Then I got Wi-Fi, and then the 2008 presidential election happened, and I got completely sucked in to the vortex. And all of a sudden, I found, and I will also say there were other reasons. I was editing a book section. I was fielding um, dozens and dozens of pitches from publicists, from freelancers, from writers who were on staff every day. I was getting when I was at the Times, we were getting something in the range of 1,000 books in the mail a week. So that's a ton of books. That's 50,000 books. And so there was an overload there too. I mean, obviously had a big section at that time, but we covered maybe 1,500 books a year. So that's a drop in the bucket when you're thinking about 50,000 books coming in a year. And so I was in a state of complete overload, and that, with coupled with the internet and the pinging of the phone and the constant email going off and all of that, my attention span was shot. I had no way of knowing how to deal with it. So I found myself in a treacherous position for someone who works as a book editor and book reviewer, which was that I couldn't read. I mean, I could read, but I couldn't maintain my concentration. So I'd read for like 5, 10 minutes, and I'd be like, oh, let's see what's going on in the election, or oh, let's see what's this or whatever. Let me check my email, or let me check this. Let me check social media. This was also the early days for me of social media. And so I didn't know what to do about it. And so when I was an editor at the Times, I had an editor who edited me. I wasn't going to edit my own work. So I talked to her, a very wise person named Orly Lowe. So I talked to her and said, I don't know what to do. I'm having a lot of trouble writing, and I'm reading, I'm sorry, and like a lot of trouble concentrating, and I'm not, I should also say that when you're a book review editor, you don't read a lot of full books. You read like a chapter or two of a book to decide whether it's something you want to assign somebody to read. So it's a very fragmented way of approaching literature. And I was like, I feel like a fraud. I feel like I should resign my job. And Orly said, no, you should write about this because if you're feeling it, a lot of other people must be feeling it. And um, maybe it would be useful. So I said, okay. And I wrote this essay, which she edited, which came out in August of 2009 in the LA Times. And yeah, a bunch of people were like, oh, you should resign your job. But way more people were like, oh, I thought I was the only one. And I got all these emails from writers, oh, like, I thought I was the only one. So it was gratifying. And it led me to start thinking about what I could do to change the way I was consuming media so that I could clear some space in my head. Not long after that, a publisher had seen it or had heard me talking about it. I can't remember now, but reached out to me and asked if I would want to write a book. And I said, I don't know. I think I may have said all I want to say, but let me think about it. And as I thought about it, there's a fantastic book from the 1990s called Ruined by Reading by the writer Lynn Sharon Schwartz, who's a New York writer, excuse me, still alive in her 80s, who's written, poetry, nonfiction, fantastic short stories and novels. Anyway, it was essentially her memoir of her life through the lens of reading. It was a very slender book. It talked a lot about, her reading as a child. It talked about what reading meant to her, the worlds that she moved in. It was gorgeous. I'd always really liked that book. And I will also say, and I think that this is really useful for aspiring writers to think about, I'm always looking for models or thinking about, oh, that's a great idea for a book. I'd like to write my version of that book. I had always kind of wanted to write my version of Ruined by Reading. So I went back to the publisher and I said, he had wanted me to do something else. I said, I don't want to do what you're thinking about, but what about a kind of autobiography through reading in which I address these questions of attention and I address the culture that we're living in, but I do it in a way that allows me also to talk about my own life as a reader. The other thing I wanted to do with that book was make it really, really immediate because the previous book was the earthquake book, which I had taken between writing the magazine article and then writing and then working on the book. It had taken about 6 years. And I had shied away from writing another book because I was like, I don't want to do that again. If you've read the my first books essay, it ends with me saying, I never have to do that again. I really felt that. But it did appeal to me to write a short, immediate book that would not require a vast amount of reporting, like out in the world reporting. It would be mostly about reading and responding to reading and personal material, and write it in its moment and address its moment. So, for instance, in that book, there's a moment where there's a section where I talk about an essay that Jeff Dyer, the writer Jeff Dyer, another writer in Southern California, British writer, but another writer in Southern California now, had written about going to see the lightning field, the land art installation in New Mexico, and had talked about experiencing narrative in real time, watching, because of the way the light hits those poles in that field, you literally experience time as a kind of narrative as the light moves through the day. I wrote that. I wasn't planning to write about that. I went out to dinner with a friend. We started talking about there was a piece. He had written a piece about this in the New Yorker. I went out to dinner with a friend. We started talking about that piece, and I was like, "Oh, this works with this book I'm writing." And the next day, I wrote it in. So it was very immediate, slightly improvisational, but very immediate. And so there was that question too. The other thing about that book, now that I'm deeply nerding out, I might as well go all the way, was that I wanted to challenge myself. In each of the books, I try to challenge myself in some way that is either stylistic or formal, something like that. And that book has no chapter breaks. That was an intentional decision for two reasons. One, I was writing a book about the slippage of attention. So I wanted to write a
Looks like
book
we
where,
have a little lag in there, but
are we lagging? Am I
you're
freezing?
back. Yeah, you're
Okay,
back.
great.
Go ahead.
I wanted to write a book because I was writing a book that dealt with kind of the difficulty of paying attention. I wanted to write a book that it was very difficult for a reader to get out of. I'm a reader who will not stop in the middle of a chapter. So if I read a book where there are no chapters, I have to read the whole book in one sitting. So I wanted to create that kind of space where the reader would have to kind of reckon with the fact that there was no easy place to put the book down. At the same time, I wanted to challenge myself as a writer and see if I could write 150 page, I think the book's 150 pages, if I could write a 150 page essay. as a kind of continuous thing without chapters, because that seemed like quite a daunting thing. And so I feel like, there are all sorts of factors that come into the construction of a book. As I say, in the case of that, it started with that article and this question about attention and reading, but it also moved from there into a series of more creative or aesthetic or formal concerns that I wanted to wrestle with.
That is really interesting. Um, okay, we have about 5 more minutes. If students want to ask some questions, you can type in the chat and I can read it for you, or you can unmute. And also, of course, faculty are welcome to ask questions too. I do see several faculty have joined us, and we invited. Also, I believe you used to teach at Antioch University.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we did invite the students and alumni from there. So if any of you would like to
Great.
pop in with a question as well, we do have a little bit of time for a question or two. And while people are thinking, um, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been living here for many, many years now, but how has writing about Los Angeles, California, changed for you over these decades?
Well, that's an excellent question. Like I say, I think it's changed for me in the sense, in the sense that my thinking, my sense of the city has changed, or my sense of of California, the place has changed, or has, I don't know if it's deepened. I mean, I'd like to think it has deepened, but well, that's not for me to decide. But I think certain things that were confounding to me, I now take for granted. Certain other things, I think probably the most specific way it's changed for me is, as we were talking about at the very beginning in terms of the configuration of Airlight, is writing less about the place than from the place. And again, in that, what that means is kind of taking the place for granted. Sidewalking, for instance, was published by University of California Press. We
Mhm.
originally we originally took the proposal to some publishers in New York, but they were all the ones that we talked to who were interested, and many of them were not interested, I should say. But the ones that were interested were 201 wanted me to explain Southern California to their readers, and I did not. If I, 10 or 15 years earlier, when I was trying to explain Southern California myself, I would have certainly done that. There's much more, let's say, explaining of California or trying to explain California in Myth of Solid Ground, which was written 10 years before. By the time I got to Sidewalking, I had no interest in explaining Southern California. I wanted to simply, I don't mean this in a bad way, I wanted to take it for granted as what it was and simply write, as I say, write from it and about it from that filter, rather than assuming I was addressing readers who didn't know anything about it. So perhaps that's more a way of saying that I was writing more directly for myself than for other readers.
Yeah. And I just, as a huge fan of Joan Didion, and you have done so much research and writing about Joan Didion, can you talk a little bit about what Didion's work means to you, like personally, but then also, well, that's the bigger question, but also in the scope of California literature, that question's too big,
Well,
but
I mean, I think, I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'll have to, because I could go on for an hour about this.
French answer.
The short answer is there are two. Okay. The short answer is that first, Didion was for me, I started, she was she was recommended to me by my mother of all people when I was 18, and I was on a year off and I was living in San Francisco, and Didion taught me a couple things. One was that the first and maybe most important, even outside of California, was she was the first, because the first two books of hers I read were Slouching Towards Bethlehem and The White Album. So she was really the first writer I read who taught me that essay writing and nonfiction was a literary activity. I mean, I was much more used to like scholarly essays or historical or stuff I'd read in school, but the idea of an essay being literary in the sense that a short story might be literary was a new one to me and very, very exciting, because I was interested in writing not just about, the stories I were reading were mostly operating kind of out of time. They weren't engaging in the social milieu of the time and place that they were taking place in, whereas Didion was, right? The essays in those two books are very much about the social milieu of California in the 60s. The other thing Didion did was she was the first writer, because I hadn't really thought about California literature at that time, time because I was young. She was the first writer who seemed to be writing about Southern California as a real place as opposed to a mythic place, and as a place with a lot of trouble and difficulties, and a place that was complicated and challenging, which it is. I mean, we all know this. We live here. And that also struck a chord in me. I wasn't, even then, I wasn't interested in the cliches. I wasn't interested in, I wasn't interested in like Lotus Land or any of that kind of stuff. I didn't believe it, and I wanted to see something deeper. And Didion, that constant peeling of surfaces, that constant peeling back of layers, that constant kind of, again, challenging her own preconceptions, her own sense of what California is. I mean, years later in Where I Was From, which might be my favorite book of hers, when she goes back and deconstructs Run River, her own first novel, as well as the sort of, pioneer myth of California, which was the myth that she was raised on. I just think it's brilliant. She was always thinking, she was always going back, she was always changing her mind. And so, in that sense, as a model of a thinker and a writer, but also as someone who was kind of describing a California I recognized more so than the Edenic California of myth, it was just I felt like I felt seen. And the last thing I'll say quickly, I have about 1 minute, is that I share a degree of her inner weather, right? That prickly dread. I am an anxious person. I expect the other shoe to drop. Her obsession, or her natural or elemental obsession, is fire, mine is earthquakes, but they are related in a certain sense. I do not trust that the universe won't rise up at any moment and bite my face off. And I don't think she did either. And so I felt a kindred spirit there also. And that's just as a reader. That doesn't have anything to do with writing or geography or anything else, but just sensibility wise.
That is beautifully said. I've never heard it said like that before, and also has me thinking about some reflection about why I love Didion so much as well. There's some parallels there. Anyways, okay, this was fabulous. Too short. We're so happy you joined us tonight. Thank you so much. Before we go, I just want to plug our Summer Creative Writing Academy Speaker Series. That kicks off in the month of July, and it's sponsored by the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. We're very lucky to have them. So I invite you all back here for our first visiting writer, who I believe is hanging out in here somewhere. Poet, essayist, writer, ear hustler, the fabulous Sherilyn Lee is going to be with us Thursday, July 3 on Zoom in the late morning, probably around 11 or 12. We're finalizing the time, and it's going to be live streamed at the PCC Creative Writing YouTube channel, but you can contact Creative Writing at pasadena.edu to join us live and bring a friend. And then later in July, we also have poet Andrew Grace, fiction writer Lori Ostling coming, and we have a playwright coming, so it's going to be a wonderful series in July. And then if I can ask you to share a little comment about your experience tonight in the chat before you go, that really helps us with writing our next year's grant for the Humanities Speaker Series. So thank you for coming. And one more round of applause for David ULIN. This has just been a fantastic conversation. We really appreciate you sharing your expertise tonight and reading your essay, which was so beautiful. And I'm going to stop the recording now so everybody can take a breath, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your attention.
And we're free. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, David. That was great. That was such a wonderful conversation. I hope we can have you back again.
Anytime. I would come back anytime. Thank
So
you so
what's
much.
that you're holding up? Is that a copy of the book?
Writing Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Which inspired us to walk Los Angeles in the 1C class. So this was actually very cool, especially since I grew up here. I was like, oh my God, I didn't even know all these things were here.